What if the price of your phone, your clothes, or even your morning coffee wasn't decided by companies, but by politics? It sounds strange, but that's exactly what happens when governments start playing with something called reciprocal taxes. You might not think about it when you shop online or grab a coffee on your way to work. But behind almost every product, there's a web of trade deals, tariffs, and negotiations between countries. In this video, we'll break down what reciprocal taxes really are, why the United States cares so much about them, and how they changed the global economy, especially during the US-China trade war. Because when the world's two largest economies start taxing each other, it's not just about money. It's about power. A reciprocal tax, or reciprocal tariff, is a tax one country places on imports from another country in response to that country's taxes or trade barriers. Think of it like this: if country A charges 20% on cars from country B, then country B says, fine, we'll charge 20% on your cars too. It's a tit-for-tat system, meant to make trade more balanced or fair. But it's not quite the same as a normal tariff. Normal tariffs are often used to protect local industries, raise government revenue, or regulate imports. Reciprocal tariffs, on the other hand, are a form of retaliation. They're meant to pressure another country into changing its policies. It's a way to say, we're not going to let you take advantage of us. The idea of reciprocity in trade has been around for centuries. In fact, even back in the 1800s, countries like Britain and France signed reciprocal trade agreements to guarantee equal treatment of goods. But in modern times, especially for the United States, the concept became a powerful political tool. To understand America's obsession with reciprocal taxes, you need to know how trade looks from its point of view. The US is the world's biggest importer. Every year, it buys trillions of dollars worth of goods from all over the world: electronics from Asia, cars from Europe, clothes from everywhere. But that also means America runs a massive trade deficit. It imports far more than it exports. And for decades, many American politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, have argued that the system isn't fair. They point out that while the US keeps its markets relatively open, other countries often have higher import taxes, or strict rules that make it harder for American companies to sell abroad. For example, before 2018, US car tariffs on European vehicles were about 2.5%. But Europe's tariffs on American cars? 10%. On paper, that's a big gap, and it became a talking point in US politics. When Donald Trump took office in 2017, he made reciprocal trade a cornerstone of his agenda. He famously said, if they charge us 50%, we'll charge them 50%. It's simple. Behind that statement was a bigger strategy, using tariffs not just to protect industries, but as bargaining chips. The US wanted to push countries to open their markets, stop government subsidies, and stop manipulating their currencies to keep exports cheap. To Washington, reciprocal taxes weren't just about fairness, they were about leverage. Nowhere was that strategy more visible than in the US-China trade war. In 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on over $250 billion of Chinese goods, including steel, aluminum, electronics, and tech components. The reasoning? Washington accused China of unfair trade practices, stealing intellectual property, forcing technology transfers, and subsidizing local industries to gain an edge. Beijing fired back almost instantly, placing its own tariffs on about $110 billion of American goods, soybeans, cars, and chemicals, among others. That back and forth continued for months. Each side announced new tariffs, then responded again. It became a spiral of escalation, a perfect example of reciprocal taxation in action. But the trade war didn't stay contained to just two countries. The effects rippled across the global economy. Companies that once relied on cheap Chinese manufacturing started moving their operations to other countries: Vietnam, India, Mexico, even back to the US in some cases. Supply chains became unstable. The cost of raw materials went up. Products that used to be cheap became more expensive. A simple example: washing machines. After the US imposed tariffs, prices for washing machines jumped nearly 20% within a year. And even though the tariffs were supposed to help American industries, many of them struggled with higher costs for imported parts. Meanwhile, global investors were nervous. Stock markets swung wildly. Businesses delayed decisions because no one knew what the next tariff would be. By early 2020, both countries signed what they called the Phase 1 agreement. China agreed to buy more American goods and tighten rules on intellectual property. But most of the tariffs remained in place. The trade war didn't really end, it just went quiet. So, who actually won? For the United States, there were short-term benefits. Industries like steel and aluminum got protection from cheaper imports. Some domestic factories even reopened, at least for a while. But the bigger picture was more complicated. Tariffs made imported goods more expensive, and that cost was often passed on to American consumers. Studies found that U.S. households were effectively paying thousands of dollars more per year because of the trade war. It became what economists called a hidden tax on the American public. Many U.S. companies also didn't bring jobs back home. Instead, they moved their production to other countries like Vietnam or Thailand to avoid tariffs. Meaning China lost the work, but America didn't necessarily gain it. For China, the short-term impact was painful. Exports to the U.S. dropped sharply, and some industries were hit hard. But Beijing quickly responded with domestic stimulus and subsidies to support key sectors. More importantly, China doubled down on self-sufficiency. The government pushed ahead with its Made in China 2025 plan, aiming to dominate high-tech industries like robotics, semiconductors, and electric vehicles. At the same time, China deepened its trade ties with other regions, Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Through deals like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, it built a network of trade that didn't rely on the U.S. In a strange way, America's tariffs may have accelerated China's rise as a global manufacturing and technology powerhouse. So while both countries suffered economically in the short term, strategically, they both adapted, and the rest of the world had to adjust. The US-China trade war didn't just change prices. It changed how global trade itself works. For decades, companies optimized supply chains purely for efficiency: the cheapest labor, the fastest shipping, the lowest cost. After the trade war, that thinking shifted. Now, governments and corporations started caring about resilience. The new buzzwords were friendshoring and decoupling. Friendshoring means moving production to politically friendly countries, nations seen as allies rather than rivals. Decoupling means separating supply chains so that one country, like China, can't disrupt another's economy too easily. You can already see this happening. Apple moved some iPhone production to India. Car makers are building battery plants in North America. Even chip manufacturers are being encouraged to produce inside the U.S. through programs like the CHIPS Act. Smaller nations like Vietnam and Mexico became unexpected winners. Factories that once stood in southern China are now popping up in places like Da Nang, Guadalajara, and Jakarta. These countries are becoming middlemen in a new world trade order, acting as bridges between East and West. But it's not all good news. For global consumers, the new system means higher prices and slower innovation. When supply chains are fragmented, efficiency drops, and costs rise. At the same time, more countries are adopting reciprocal tariffs as negotiation tools. India, Brazil, and even the European Union have used similar tactics when dealing with the US or China. The world has entered a new era, one where trade isn't just about goods, but about influence, security, and control. Reciprocal taxes began as a way to demand fairness. But over time, they turned into a weapon, one that reshapes how countries compete and cooperate. The US-China trade war proved that tariffs can do more than protect industries. They can shift alliances, rewrite global supply chains, and redefine economic power. For ordinary people, it's easy to think these issues are far away, numbers on a government spreadsheet. But every time you notice a price increase, a product delay, or a made-in label that changed, you're seeing the effects of these policies. In the end, reciprocal taxes remind us that in a globalized world, every tax is more than money, it's a message. And America's message, whether you agree with it or not, is loud and clear.